Be still and know. These 4 words, in this specific order, are a key which unlock the mysteries surrounding stillness, as well as its lost art. And this is not to say, know a way to be still to then know. Simply, be still and know. Reflecting upon these words, one may catch a subtle twist of this key, and it is right there in the center, with that word and. In the middle of stillness and knowing, implying a transition. Stillness, at first glance, seems like the end, death, a complete standstill. But the truth is, it's not an end. It is not only nothing, because then there is nothing to still, but it contains everything. And this stillness leads not to knowledge, but something beyond it. It leads to knowing. That knowing beyond Plato's divided line. That knowing that desire longs for. The knowing that opens the senses to actually see, hear, taste, touch, smell, and perceive beyond. And in this reflection, ever so slightly again, the key has turned yet another revelation about stillness. With all of this sensing and desiring, and especially knowing, we see that this stillness that we will explore is directly related to consciousness. And not just the conscious and unconscious mind, but body as well. But before chasing ahead to get to the fruits, we must first humbly explore what it means to be still. This is the art that has been lost, and it is ever so important to remember because without it, we know nothing. As simple as these words sound, be still, a look at our society reveals its opposite. As we will explore, the masses are restless, and they've become so distracted they don't realize their restlessness. And in this, mind, body, being, consciousness suffers. Be still. Take a clear look at this phrase we've lost and defiled. Be still. It's quite the paradox when you stop and look at it. Because before the word still, implying no motion, there's a verb, be, implying a motion, an action. And as we will come to see throughout the video, motion is as part of stillness as stillness is to motion. To begin to grasp this paradox, let's use this video, or any video you've ever watched as an example, because in all the perceived motion, it's actually all still. I may have held your interest up to this point, but by saying the essence of video is still may lose many of you. You can use your eyes to perceive the motion, logically reason with yourself that video is moving, and hence judge me from your clear logic and experience that a video is different from, say, a still picture. But anyone familiar with the dynamics of film would know it's all put together frame by frame, moment by moment, hence the name motion picture. And in all these still movements, there is a great unknown stillness in between, connecting the frames. Applying this simple analogy to life itself begins to open one up to that same stillness that paradoxically lies within all the movements of nature itself. This is life, a still motion, which leads us back to the paradoxical phrase, be still. To be still has become quite the circus. Many talk about the stillness of the present moment, claim they are entering it, acting towards it. I am entering the now. I meditate in the now. This music, this mantra, this setting, this teacher will bring me into the stillness required to experience now. But all the theatrics gets in the way of what actually is happening now. Because to be in the now is to be still, and anything brought with you disturbs the stillness required to be with what is now. Besides, by the time you're setting up the scene, the now is passed on by. This is a point that is most overlooked about the truth of now. Have you ever realized how fast it all comes and goes? A tremendous energy and vitality is required to keep up, To be still in awareness of now, and then now, and here and now. How fast things become, how fast thoughts arise, a pleasure is craved, the speed at which the senses suddenly sense something, and the following movement of the mind as it begins to build its images around it, triggering corresponding thoughts and emotions around this image. How fast the psyche moves, and even in body. Have you ever realized how quickly the body becomes ill, sick? Have you ever been attentive enough to be aware of the transition within before any surface symptoms show? Now is faster than the speed of light and requires a consciousness, a vitality, a being, an awareness that is able to keep up. Any consciousness with a body stressed by its processed diet or mind by its subjective beliefs takes away the energy required to live now. A dulled and distracted consciousness has no hope of experiencing anything real. Now is like the frame of this video, still, yet moves on faster than a blink. And the stillness in the now moves much faster than you could think and ration about, and thus requires another state of consciousness outside the normal rationing and knowledge we've grown accustomed to. This is where our exploration into this lost art of stillness is leading us, not just into emptiness and a lack of motion, but complete fullness in motion, and not just personal consciousness, but the consciousness which essentially makes us all one. This journey into stillness leads us back through time, weaving itself throughout individuals in science, philosophy, music, art, religion, and spirituality. A lot will be discussed in what follows, yet not once can I show you stillness, lead you there. And this is the most important thing to remember, because stillness is a state of consciousness, and the only way to understand a state of consciousness is to experience it oneself. And even if you choose to ignore stillness, to run along with the restless masses in ignorance, there is no avoiding it, as it awaits each and every one of us at the end. And I'm not just speaking of death, but as we end the day in the stillness of sleep. So in all the motion that follows, be still. If stillness reveals the secrets of eternity, a lack of stillness covers up these secrets, and a look at our present day shows just how veiled it's all become. We are caught and bound in a restless cycle, and it is something humanity has never faced before, because for the first time we are too distracted to notice our restlessness. We are closing into a point where the individual will ask, why use my intellect when AI can do it for me? Why go out in nature when I can go anywhere in virtual reality? Why tend my body, my soul, my spirit, if I could take a pill or just push it all off to my therapist? You see, I'm doing the disservice of making noise about a rather silent word, only because, as Lao Tzu said thousands of years ago, restlessness weakens the mind. Trust me, if there was no harm to human beings with their fancy objects, I'd not say a thing. But when awareness is narrowed and loses its attention, consciousness loses its roots. And without roots, consciousness either becomes inflated or possessed, and most importantly, programmed. Additionally, our distractions are not only distracting us away from our roots, they're feeding into our restlessness. The best way to summarize this feedback loop, what restlessly distracting one's consciousness, being, leads to, can be found in a simple Taoist formula. It runs something along the lines of, the mind is the residence of the spirit. A wild mind is always in motion. When the mind is not still, the spirit is distracted. When the spirit is distracted, it attaches itself to the 10,000 things. When the 10,000 emerge, cravings and desires to fulfill them arise. And because of cravings and desires to fulfill them, anxiety and stresses are stimulated. And as anxieties and stresses become commonplace, mind and body are afflicted by tensions. Through it all, being suffers. It attaches, it craves, it stresses, it is tense, and thus scattered away from itself and stretched thin. A shallow surface without any depth. In this formula, you'll notice 3 feedback loops which come together to scatter consciousness thin. The distractions and restlessness, the 10,000 things and cravings or desire to fulfill them, and stress and anxiety afflicting the mind and body with tension. Let's quickly look at each loop to grasp what we lost and what it means for consciousness. It all begins with a lack of stillness. We, especially in the West, have become so restless that our own natural need, sleep, is difficult to organically achieve. It is so distorted, most need a distraction, a song, a sound, a pill, a blanket, something to distract them to rest. Without coming to rest, sleeping for 24 hours, one will notice mental and physical changes, such as reaction time reduced, memory and attention are diminished, speech begins to slur, and one becomes irritable. Hidden under these surface symptoms are the stimulation of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol to compensate for the fatigue. At 36 to 48 hours, as these hormones are continuing to be stimulated to compensate for the fatigue, the body is hormonally off balance. Metabolism is slowed, and one becomes chaotic in attention, mood, body temperature, and appetite. After this, many start slipping into the research phenomenon called microsleep, and up to this day, there's no record of anyone staying up longer than 18 days. You see where I'm leading us? We've become so restlessly distracted that we don't realize we live in a manner which is the same as struggling to drink, eat, or breathe. The other side of this restlessness is distractions. What I want to highlight on this point is the idea of neuroplasticity. The brain, and thus your subjective experience, adapts. The findings are exciting, as many were taught that the brain develops into its potential around 25, and it's fixed as it is. But with the findings of neuroplasticity, we realize that the brain is no longer fixed. This at first glance is a beautiful revelation, but then you realize the implications when you factor in a distracted mind. In a book, correctly titled The Shallows, Nicholas Carr highlights the effects of the internet on humanity. He writes, "The more we use the web, the more we train our brains to be distracted, to process information very quickly and very efficiently, but without sustained attention. It would be rash to jump to the conclusion that the internet is undermining our moral sense. It would not be rash to suggest that the net reroutes our vital paths and diminishes our capability for contemplation. It is altering the depth of our emotions as well as our thoughts. As I said, if our distractions weren't hurting us, I wouldn't say a thing, but they're invisibly having an effect on the receiver and decoder of consciousness. The state of affairs is not only rewiring our brains, but afflicting our souls. And if a receiver is distorted, so will anything it receives. In this inability to attend, many have become mindless consumers of data. Everything's become a unit, a 1 or a 0. And in this, empathy towards others is diminished. Intelligent signals become noise, and the only knowledge one has is what it can consume. Knowledge is power, yes, but what is knowledge without intelligence? Ultimately, this restless distraction takes being away from its roots, and this overconscious pull to the materials, the internet, the artificials, within, the inner, the soul, the unconscious are out of sight, and without one's own life source, they must outsource themselves. Bringing us to the next feedback loop, the 10,000 things and cravings or desires to fulfill them. The 10,000 are not limited to outer or material matter, but also inner matter, such as thoughts, emotional states, complexes, traumas, and beliefs. It is here where the distorted receiver of consciousness becomes dulled. Additionally, it is here where the 10,000, the emotions they stimulate, and desire to feel this sensation again programs individuals, along with their soul. The 10,000 become attachments we bind to. They provide stability, yes, but it's all short-lived, and thus consumption is constant. In this cycle, consciousness becomes overstimulated, and when one is restlessly stimulating themselves with the 10,000 distractions, one becomes desensitized, further withering one's natural roots and essence. A mass dissociation, where conflict rules. And what is rather harrowing to realize is when individuals begin disassociating with their own nature, the collective essence of humanity becomes undone. And we're seeing this shine throughout the world today, as what binds people together is not being a human being, as well as sharing that same eternal spirit contained in everything in the universe, but rather some image, some thought, some group, a trend, an ideology, another 10,000 things other than being human. A simple example to understand this mass dulling of the human being can be seen through the sensation of taste. If one handed someone on the American diet a meal without salt, they would say there's no taste to it. It's bland. But if you take this same blandness to someone who has fasted for a day or two, they'll taste a lot more. When one is still, they're sensitive and able to pick up on these subtleties that one restless and stimulated cannot sense. Another important point to highlight with the 10,000 and their cravings is the addictions we form. It all works in a similar yet opposite way of a trauma. If we have a memory of something that scared us or hurt us or caused pain, it's avoided. But anything that makes us feel good, causes pleasure, happiness, well, it's consumed. In this, perception becomes influenced and distorted by memory. And one seeing through the past, instead of through a perception that's always afresh and new, able to be with whatever is now. So the 10,000 are consumed, blasting the hormones to stimulate briefly, and then when they wear off, there is that instinct to fulfill. And you see the cravings are taking away our own natural innate intelligence, which is instinct. And it's all become a self-inflicted condition or program. Through it all, one becomes reactive instead of reflective. This then leads to the final feedback loop, the stresses, the depressions, and anxieties. All that tenses up mind and body. And to summarize this feedback loop, one can simply call it dis-ease, illness. Research has provided countless examples of that link between chronic stress and the immune system. For example, chronic load of stress accumulates and eventually takes a toll on aspects of your health. This happens because, unless the body has a chance to recuperate, the effective stress hormones accumulate and build up. These ideas have been born out of the work of Bruce McEwen. McEwen, who has worked on stress and stress hormones for more than 30 years, has shown experimentally that the cumulative effects of high-dose steroids have a different, more long-lasting and harmful impact than if the body produces single, short bursts of them. McEwen calls the compounding of stress effects the theory of allostatic load. What kind of stresses can deplete the body's will to fight? Chronic illness is one, and of course psychological stresses, but there are others as well. Strenuous, unaccustomed, and prolonged physical stress, equivalent to running to your max on a treadmill, for example, but lasting for days, or chronic physiological stress such as a lack of sleep or food, will all deplete the stress hormone reserves. At first, such chronic stresses keep the response switched on, working at its maximum as long as the stress persists. But if such extremes persist, the response can fail, reach exhaustion, and finally burn out. Without stillness, the mind and soul are lost, and eventually, as this author states, the body gives up. Stress, the internet, all of it is not to be denied and rejected. Stress is essential for alerting the body and mind. There's a healthy state of stress, but when it becomes chronic, it's harmful. And the internet, it's just a tool. If anyone gave their life to the hammer, looked at it all day and depended on it, or even outright rejected its use, then they are a fool. But to use the hammer in its right place is wisdom. Everything has their function, their place, just as one's being needs time to breathe. Because without the ability to give it that space to breathe, all of your physical breaths cannot keep it alive, to the point where chronic stress exhausts the body's will to fight. So as we've just about lost it, I want to take us back to a time where stillness was as mainstream as losing it is today. To get back to the roots of what stillness means, I want to begin today and travel back to an ancient time where this state of consciousness was recognized in the West. We'll begin this quest with two mystical types alive today who have said a lot about stillness. I'll assume many of you know Eckhart Tolle and the many words he has on stillness. And another I'll add, who provides most of the material used in this section, is Peter Kingsley. As we continue on to those who've recently passed, we find a Christian leader who knew the divinity in stillness, Mother Teresa, and another, completely opposite of religion, Jiddu Krishnamurti, mirrors the same essence of stillness in his own unique way. For anyone familiar with most of my videos, you'll notice I cover Carl Jung, and he also captures this stillness, not only in the sentence on the screen, in his tower in Bollingen, but in his active imaginations, as they require a certain state of stillness that allows that other, the depths, the underworld, the unconscious, to become holy as it is. And while Jung found his stillness in his tower, Nietzsche found it on his walks outside. Hidden within his work, Nietzsche shares his own art of stillness, finding it in his strolls alone in nature, walks that led to insights in such works as Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Continuing back in time, the famous poet Edgar Allan Poe, in his own poetic style, beautifully captures it. It also finds its place in science, not only a space many great scientists came to their theories and discoveries, but a space that still has science stumped. Continuing on in time, we'll notice that it's in music, in such artists like Mozart, and even in politics, as we see it in the work of the great Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And finally, it's contained in every single spiritual or religious practice in their own unique language and symbolism. It's in Islam, it's in Christianity, Taoism, and Buddhism. In the many avenues I could take to highlight stillness, I want to focus in on two ancient Greeks who helped birth this technological Western world we have all become a part of. Science has been the catalyst for just about everything we know, especially technology. And the science which developed all the technology we restlessly use wouldn't be possible without mathematics, as well as logic. Without logic, a scientific theory cannot be expressed. And without math, the dynamics behind a theory couldn't be shown. And while many others can be attributed to birthing this logic and mathematics behind science, there are two central figures to each at its early roots. To logic, known by many as the father of logic, is Parmenides, and to mathematics, Pythagoras. And there's a common link sacred to each. I'd imagine you can guess it. Stillness. And not just a silly quote where it's merely mentioned here or there, but something truly lived by each. It was a part of their life, and essential to their teachings. Science began with a spiritual tie, as it was the divinity of nature which was explored. Through the still observations and harmony with nature, the ancients were curious about its divine laws. Quite the difference to our science today, who instead of placing themselves at one with nature, they've attempted to master and dominate it. But I've already spoken enough about our present-day condition, so let us take a look at these essential figures to the West in science, who lived what we've lost. First, Pythagoras, someone where a lot is attributed, yet nothing firsthand of his remains today. He is said to have taught his students that number is the essence of the created universe. Number is being. And that the cosmos was created and ordered according to the divine ideal plan or pattern. I personally encounter the power of numbers as well as the divinity of it all while I studied the atmosphere. I was previously a TV meteorologist, and anyone knows there's a sense of prophecy in any weather forecast. While there's a running joke that the weatherman's always wrong, there's no denying that numbers can predict the future. And while we don't have the writings of Pythagoras available, whether at the time or he never recorded anything, we do have a sense of what it means to become a student of his, or what was called a mathematikoi. To be a student of Pythagoras was a whole different purpose than our mindless education of today. It wasn't about conditioning, but rather unfolding. And there was no fee to enter, no loan to take out. There wasn't a written test that one must pass. All there was an initiation. Not only to be still enough to grasp the teachings, but to make sure that the soul was properly prepared. And when I say only an initiation, it was not as easy as it sounds. According to Amplicus's On the Pythagorean Life, each candidate had to undergo a series of tests, meted out over several stages. The author prefaces the listing of requirements with a quasi-religious exposition of Pythagoras' supernatural ability to heal ignorance, the soul's most tenacious affliction. The means he offers is purification, and its aim is to restore sight to the soul, so that it may redirect towards the object of thought, its divine eye. What I find so interesting about Pythagoras' system of education is this initiation he made each student go through before speaking to them. For example, it is said that he evaluated initiates' souls or unconscious habits and ignored them for 3 years. And then if this is passed, he sends them off for another 5 to live in absolute silence. It was all a process of unlearning, of purification, or what some would call an ego death, before anything was learned. This is an idea that will come up later in the video. Continuing on Pythagoras' connection to stillness, Peter Kingsley, who I'm grateful for pointing me out to the significance of such figures before the time of Plato and Socrates, writes, "The Pythagoreans happened to attach extraordinary importance to stillness. This wasn't just a matter of the silence imposed on people who wanted to become Pythagoreans. That was a part of the picture, but only a small part. For behind the silence there was a whole dimension of significance to the practice of stillness. It all had to do with dreams, with other states of awareness. The outer techniques of stillness that Pythagoreans practiced, the silence, the deliberate calm, physically not even moving, weren't simple ends in themselves. They were means that were used for the sake of reaching something else, and their purpose was straightforward enough, even though the ancient source speaks a language most of us no longer understand, or want to understand. The purpose was to free people's attention from distractions, to turn it in another direction so that their awareness could start operating in an entirely different way. The stillness had a point to it, and that was to create an opening into a world unlike anything we're used to, a world that can only be entered in deep meditation, ecstasies, and dreams. Additionally, Kingsley links Pythagoras with an ancient practice of achieving the stillness, rooted in that previous mentioned ego death, or dying before you die. When he, Pythagoras, left his home island of Samos for Italy, he took Anatolian traditions with him, techniques of incubation, techniques for descending to the world of the dead. In a sign of how dedicated he was to the goddess of the underworld, he made his home in southern Italy into a temple, built a special underground room where he'd go and stay motionless for long periods of time. Afterwards, he'd describe how he'd gone down to the underworld and come back as a messenger from the gods. The reports about him say he taught his closest disciples to do the same thing, and the language of the reports show it was the practice of incubation that he taught them. The mysteries of the underworld remained central for later Pythagoreanism, and so did the role that the Pythagoreans kept giving to incubation. For it wasn't a tradition of people who were fond of ideas and beautiful theories. There were people who knew how to die before they died. We could safely assume that this practice of stillness was a way of life to the Pythagoreans, and Pythagoras himself. And as we quickly shift our attention now to Parmenides, it'll be a rather easy transition, as not only was this ancient practice of incubation a part of his life as well, but it was also a Pythagorean who was Parmenides' teacher. Kingsley writes about Parmenides and his teacher. He, Parmenides, took part in the teaching given by Amenius the Pythagorean. Amenius was a poor man, but a good one, and a fine one. This was the man whose teachings he chose to follow. And it wasn't through Xenophanes, but through Amenius that he was led to stillness, hesychia. Parmenides was taught by a Pythagorean, and the teaching was what you would expect from a Pythagorean. They teach to unteach, so that one may be taught rightly. Unlike Pythagoras, we are able to get a sense of what Parmenides brought into this world through stillness in his own tongue. This ancient figure, who is important enough to show up throughout Plato's writings, has fragments of his poems still available today. I created an entire video on the fragments for anyone interested in them, but one thing anyone with eyes and ears will sense in the poem is the presence of stillness. While Parmenides describes being, universal consciousness, as something still, I want to highlight how his poem, and all the logic which follows, begins. The opening sentence says, "The mares that carry me as far as longing can reach rode on. Once they had come and fetched me onto the legendary road of the divinity that carries the man who knows through the vast and dark unknown." Parmenides then reveals he is taken to the underworld, the same underworld Pythagoras entered in his underground room. We already see right in the first line that it's something other which is doing all the carrying and willing. And it's on this journey where he was presented his logic, that logic which helped birth what we know as Western logic. But you see, this logic, this logos, is of pure nature. It is of that intelligence beyond the artificial, beyond knowledge. So just as Parmenides' teacher taught him stillness, we could see where this stillness led. And to come to these revelations, this intelligence, is to be taken into another state of consciousness. And to reach that state, just as Pythagoras, Parmenides practiced incubation. That meditation that's not only unique to ancient Greece, but throughout ancient Egypt and in texts like the Vedas. So what exactly is this lost ancient meditation? Peter Kingsley explains, there was a specific and established technique among various groups of people for making the journey to the world of the dead, for dying before you die. It involved isolating yourself in a dark place, lying down in complete stillness, laying motionless for hours or days. First the body would go silent, then eventually the mind. And the stillness is what gives access to another world, a world of utter paradox, a totally different state of awareness. And as to why one would want to enter the state of awareness, Kingsley continues, anyone who was sick or needed guidance would come and do nothing else except lie down in utter stillness. The most common Greek word for this stillness was hesychia, without moving, hardly breathing, for hours, even days at a time, just like animals hibernating in their lair. This isn't a meditation with a set mantra. There's no concoction to drink in the woods, no breathing rhythm to count out and follow, no music, no colorful lights. This is a meditation of truly no thing. Peter Kingsley uses the term suspended animation to describe it. And just like the seed, which is stilled yet contains all the intelligence it needs, this meditation is both truly subjective and thingless. In addition, an important point to highlight about the quote above reveals the purpose of incubation, that being both prophecy and healing. We spoke about the magic key of stillness, be still and know, but I could as well have said, be still and heal. The healers or doctors of the past, those overlooking the dark layers of incubation, were also the priests, something akin to a shaman, a title that links to Parmenides. Peter Kingsley highlights that an inscription on a marble block was found at an archaeological site in Parmenides' hometown of Elea in 1962. It wrote, Parmenides, son of Pyres, Oleiades Physicos. Pyres was known as Parmenides' father. Oleiades is not as straightforward. As Kingsley writes on this title, those people weren't just ordinary healers. They were sons and priests of Apollo. Healers belonging to a world of itromantus figures concerned with incubation, dreams, and ecstasy. A world of magicians who speak in poetry and oracles and riddles, who used incantations to enter other states of consciousness. And the final title at the archaeological site attributed to Parmenides is Physicos. And while it's of the same essence as the world we know today as physician, it's a bit more mysterious, because the medicine, the medium, was matterless. The physicos, described by Kingsley, was someone who was concerned with the basic principles of existence, who was able to touch the bare bones of what things are, and also use the knowledge that he finds. This is why it became a normal term for describing magicians and alchemists. So we see a link to Parmenides not only to raw nature itself, its bare bones, but also stillness. He was considered a son or priest of Apollo. And Apollo is, according to some, the god of incubation, a totally different essence of Apollo than we've been educated, or rather programmed on today. This is that same Apollo that many forget is the god of the Temple of Delphi, as well as many other prophetic sites in mainstream ancient Greece. And before I get ahead of myself, I briefly want to mention that it is Asclepius who was Apollo's son, that Asclepius so worshipped throughout many healing sanctuaries that also had a space for incubation. And if you think I'm stretching things to try to connect healing to stillness, just look at the symbolism of modern medicine. Many doctors take an oath that's based off of the Hippocratic Oath. And in the original form, that oath begins, I swear by Apollo, healer, by Asclepius. And as I said, it's the symbol of our medicine, as we know that symbol is a snake curling up a rod, which is that rod of Asclepius. Asclepius will come forth shortly in a bit, so let's get back to Apollo. One may ask, why would he be considered the god of incubation? Peter Kingsley answers, for the Greeks, the god of this other state of awareness was Apollo. In his consciousness, space and time mean nothing. He can see and be anywhere. Past and future are as present as the present is for us. And so he was the god of ecstasy, trance, cataleptic states, of states that take you somewhere. There was a single word in Greek to express this. It meant taken by Apollo. And to wrap up this bow on incubation, stillness, and the ancient Greeks who seeded science into our modern world, Kingsley says, Pythagoras himself was nameless. Pythagoreans avoided mentioning him by name because his identity was a mystery, in the same way that they often avoided mentioning each other's names, or the names of the gods. As far as they were concerned, Pythagoras wasn't only the man he appeared to be. They knew him as a son of Apollo, or, quite simply, as Apollo himself. Apollo, healing and prophecy, incubation and stillness are all of great importance to Parmenides and Pythagoras. So let us further explore this mysterious state of awareness, which takes one straight and into consciousness itself. When reflecting upon Apollo and the essence this symbol is pointing towards, we begin to see the dynamics of stillness and its relationship to different states of consciousness. Look at this notion of being carried or taken by Apollo, or even healed by Asclepius. In order for a non-physical god to perform such an action, there must be something non-physical acted upon. This signifies a split between subject and object, the object in this case being Apollo, as he is the one essence which carries all individuals, as well as the subject of individuals being carried. But these two become a three when reflecting upon the subject, because every subject has a personal conscious and unconscious mind. For the conscious mind, I'll name ego in the rest of this video, and the unconscious mind, soul. Before getting into this rather objective and archetypal state of consciousness where one's taken, leading towards that knowing, the healing, we must first begin with the personal. It is in the interplay between the personal conscious and unconscious mind where we see just how ingrained stillness is in consciousness. The first state of consciousness we all experience, a state that has dominated our modern culture, is waking consciousness. This is generally when the personal conscious mind, the ego, is active, willing, moving, carrying, or analogous to Apollo in this state, while the personal unconscious mind, the soul, is passive, still, receptive, is being carried. We all have our own unconscious habits, patterns, beliefs, and the rest, which we've all built through our subjective will. And I say generally the ego is active in waking consciousness because we all know just how much our own willing and movement in waking consciousness is influenced and directed by the unconscious. Also how quickly the moving ego can be overpowered by an unconscious memory, desire, projection, or thought-feeling form. While waking consciousness is necessary in its own respect, it is wise to always remember the power the unconscious holds over the ego. The second general state of consciousness we all experience, yet many remain ignorant of, is sleeping or dreaming consciousness. In this deeper state of consciousness, it's the soul that's active, it's willing, it's moving, it's providing, while the ego is passive, it's still, it's receptive. Reflecting upon these two states of consciousness, you'll notice an active and passive dance taking place. In all the movement of waking and sleeping or dreaming consciousness, stillness allows it all to be. Think about it. If the soul is not still or receptive enough to be aware of what is happening in waking consciousness, the human subject would never learn how to speak, let alone walk. The opposite is also true, as we already saw what happens to consciousness when the ego doesn't come to rest. I can bore you with examples and dive into these two states of consciousness and its relationship to stillness, but there's still that deeper layer to name. Waking consciousness can be seen as consciousness at the surface. Sleeping consciousness begins digging into the stems and roots of consciousness. And this final state, where incubation leads, when Apollo and the gods are present, is the intelligent spirit which gives the roots and surface life. In Jungian terms, this is the collective unconscious, that source which allows us all to have egos and souls, to be conscious subjects. Consciousness, allegorical to an electromagnetic field, requires two ends for life. When your car battery needs a jolt, you don't just plug one end in, or two of the same end in, but the opposites provide it life. And that life is the collective essence of consciousness, that spark, which is also contained in the negative and positive. A true mystery, and thus is consciousness. It's only possible through the opposites, but its essence is what lies beyond the opposites. Now the only question that remains is, what does it mean to be carried by Apollo? First, one must not only still their ego, but also their soul. If the ego's forcing itself into meditation to be still, yet the soul's wrapped up in some addiction, some attachment, some desirously worldly trapping, this state is never achieved. Similarly, if the depths are attempting to push through unconscious information, but the ego is not receptive and open to it, or is distracted, then the unknown can never be known. Ego and soul must be still, receptive, to allow this other activity to take place. To the ego, it will feel like the other, beyond one's mere personal shadows. Both conscious and unconscious mind must be in harmony. They must be carried together, and thus no conflict can arise between them. There must be a union between the two, as this state of consciousness leads to and through the opposites. So as the individual and its unconscious are in harmony, and they're still, then this third state of consciousness can be entered. The state of awareness, as I said, is beyond the opposites, beyond the ego and soul, and thus beyond the personal. This essence, or spirit, is archetypal in all, the essence of consciousness itself, which has been unconsciously conscious since eternity. And contained in it is the collective essence of humanity, an intelligence all have within that runs deeper than all the knowledge you can consume in one lifetime. It contains what's past and what's to come. It's that intelligence which not only created the parts of our body, like the heart and brain, but also consciousness itself. And as one reflects on this third state of consciousness, you can see the wholeness contained in it. It's a personal and collective affair, requiring the trinity of consciousness to function as one. This is where stillness leads. This is where incubation for the Greeks, or the idea of tapas in the East, led the individual. And it's this deep collective essence which contains the insight and intelligence for all the healing and knowings which follows stillness. Now we'll expand on these ideas in the next section on the art of stillness, but there's still something very important to highlight, and it's closely related to this third state of consciousness. As I was putting the video together, I realized a rather sinister way stillness and the magical key we've been speaking about could be used against you. As we've seen, stillness is both still and motion. The stilled is the receptive, and the motion is the provider. And when the ego or soul, or both ego and soul are receptive, what it is receiving has an impression on consciousness. This is all and well if the impression is organic and natural, say a deep meditation, incubation, tapas. But when the impression is of a distorting and illusory nature, say an inorganic suggestion, then it unwillingly becomes a part of one's being. There are various methods, such as fear, which provide the right atmosphere to still the ego and soul, the individual. I'm sure you know other ways of achieving this stillness, but I want to highlight something a bit more subtle which came to my mind, and that is hypnosis. And not the actual act of being hypnotized by a mere hypnotist, but by other mediums. For instance, the television or social media provide mediums to hypnotize or carry in the ego and soul. In reflecting upon these thoughts, you could see how this exchange of information mimics that same stillness that follows deep meditation. This is why these subtle tactics have been used for centuries by people, politicians, and businesses to move what they stilled towards their likings. And nowadays, the formula is still effective. It's just a bit more subtle. And if you could restlessly distract a conscious individual into hypnosis, there's no telling what information you could feed into their soul. So it is not only wise to bring yourself back to stillness for the sake of consciousness, but also protect yourself from being hypnotized into stillness to learn what another wants you to know. This is no easy task, as it is a lost art, an art of cultivation which we can now begin to explore. When reflecting upon this stillness we have been exploring, you'll notice something mysteriously beautiful. That is, in all the knowings, the healings, and the movements which follow being still, there's nothing for you to do. The art has taken shape. It all flows rightly on its own merit. And because of this, the art of stillness centers around the idea of being still. More specifically, stilling your conscious and unconscious mind. To reach this state of awareness, there's another difficult barrier besides our modern-day restlessness to cross over into and beyond stillness, and that is death. It is something we all instinctually resist, and with good intentions, because it is the greatest unknown. It warrants such fear and resistance. Our collective innate reaction to death, from the plants and animals striving every day to survive, to our own human instincts around this reality, provides a clear example of this instinctual resistance against it. But as we will see, the paradox of it all is those resisting death never live, and those who begin to die experience life and its hidden mysteries. We remember Pythagoreans were individuals who knew the art of dying before you die. Christians die and are reborn in baptism. It's an idea ingrained in many spiritual and religious practices. There's something eternal about this idea. But what does it mean to die before you die? The first clue is that it doesn't mean to cease to exist. To die before dying means there's still life. The second hint about this death is that it's centered around the subject, the individual. What is you compared to I or another watching this video is how we shape and form consciousness. The archetypal emotions like love or fear or anger are not what separate us. The states of consciousness such as waking or dreaming do not separate us. We all long and desire. We all have archetypal traits which are common. What separates you and I is what sprouts from the archetypal. Our personal attachments, identities, habits, addictions, shadows, and complexes. To die before you die doesn't mean to resist the instincts, the archetypes, the desires, the love or fear or anger or any emotion. If you resist or repress anything, then there's movement, and our focus here is on the art of stilling. The instincts, the emotions, the archetypes all have their common place in the psyche and have a purpose. And this dying before you die is surely not the grand illusion into thinking there's no subjectivity in your consciousness. To die before you die is to rid oneself of the subjectively built beliefs, biases, habits, programs, pleasures, attachments, identities, dependencies, complexes, all the personal forms which distort the senses and essence of consciousness. This death is not the death of the ego or soul, but the destruction of both the ego's and soul's distorted images of itself, a release from its objects so they can fall back into their right place. And this destructive road, which leads to this release, this death, necessary for stillness, is purification. The purification we spoke on earlier, the process which Pythagoreans all went through. This is the earlier mentioned idea of unlearning to begin to learn rightly. Purification at first glance seems like a fluffy, fun, sweet, blissful, white light experience. But purification is better symbolized by fire. And it all begins in the black, the dark. Because everything you hold to, your known, is let go. And in this you step into that true unknown where the only sense of knowing begins. Like kicking an addiction, there's a process of unbinding the bonds. As they say, old habits die hard. The loosening of the programs, the beliefs, the opinions, the complexes, habits, traumas, learned behaviors, identities, dependencies. It'll all feel like death. Because it's not something that's ignored. It's not pushed away. It's not stimulated over. But it's lived through. Better put, died through. And this purification and psychic energy felt through this living or dying through leads to its release. If one wants to visualize it neurologically, all the neurological connections we make must be halted and cut. It hurts, it is painful, and thus is the truth about purifying oneself. Without untying the brain into the knot you, with the help of others, tied yourself in, nothing will ever change. You'll enter your calmness, your yoga class, your 5 minutes of quiet, and yet all that keeps you needing your class or quiet time is still following you around. Because it all lies deeper than the surface you're calming. Thus purification is not only focused on the ego, but also the soul, the unconscious. Purification, the prerequisite for being still, is difficult. It hurts. A lot is unseen and takes place in the dark. And even when we know we have a bad habit, a flawed ideology, wild emotions, and attention that has been decimated, they are so difficult to heal. And this is because they're all unconsciously soft-wired into our souls, our psyches. And just like training to ride a unicycle, which takes multiple attempts to condition oneself to ride, there's no quick fix. As I said, it requires the ego, the subject, to suffer through it. In the ancient healing temples of Asclepius, we spoke about the incubation room underground of the main healing sanctuary. It was written that anyone who entered the bottom floor for incubation would be required to practice certain purification rites, such as diet, bathing, 3-day sexual abstinence, a detachment from witnessing birth or seeing a corpse or attending a funeral, and wearing a proper white gown. When reflecting upon it, you could see the point of it all, as it's removing all personal lingering thoughts, emotions, even down to foods, from infiltrating and distorting the ego and soul in incubation. And you see why purification is such an important part to mental and physical stillness. In this receptive, open, pure and empty awareness that other, the subtle, can be received. Be still and know should be rephrased to purify, be still and know. You could sit around in a shade of stillness for years and years, searching, looking, praying, hoping. But one cannot be pure if they're always getting in the way. And with you out of the way, the psyche, the intellect, can begin to function rightly. Socrates had a warning during his time as writing began to develop into civilization, as many saw it as a way to become more conscious and help improve memory. On the contrary, though, Socrates saw it as a disservice to consciousness. He says people will begin to rely on words and lose the ability to remember. Instead, it'll all be a reminder. And to remember is not simply remembering memories of your own experience, but a re-remembering of the intelligence within you since the beginning of mankind. This is why he is known for his dialectic method, which asks the seeker of knowledge questions to awaken in themselves the answers. He respected and trusted the soul and spirit to come through. Additionally, at the temple of Apollo, of which we're all familiar with in Delphi, the oracle proclaimed Socrates to be the wisest among all men, because as the myth famously says, Socrates was wisest because he was humble enough to know that he did not know. He, his I, did not know. All other men had that pride, of which Socrates humbly set aside because he died before he died. To get a sense of the consciousness and intelligence Socrates trusted in, one only has to reflect upon the animal. They are unbelievably intelligent without a single word spoken, a single school lesson, a single book. And if you want to even go further into this intelligence and stillness, spend a free day solely reflecting on the intelligence of the cycle of a flowering plant or tree. The only way to this intelligence is through stillness. There is this trust in that spirit and that intelligence that Socrates had, that the animals and plants move through, which humanity seems to have lost. But you could see the difficulty for us humans, with our logic and reasoning, to trust something which lets us down. We all see the horrors of nature. We all see the pains we go through. There's chaos. We've been let down. Our hearts have been broken over and over again. And so it's difficult to trust nature and trust something unseen. But without trust, there is no stillness, no union, no love. And a soul without love is rotten. I noticed as I began to enter stillness, something unexpected began to occur. I tell this not to think I'm special, as anything I could do, you can do. But what happened was nature began to embrace me. Animals that I've always been around, and those in the wild, changed their ways towards me. They approached me. There was this attraction, almost magnetic, and I pondered what it all could be. What came through and seemed most logical is that there is this invisible sense that animals can instinctually trust, a trust that is connected through stillness. This is the art of stillness, a connection with oneself and thus the universe and its eternal spirit holding it all together. So just as it is awkward to say purification leads to death, it is as equally as awkward to say that there's a discipline in order to die before you die. Now, with all this said, what as subjective individuals can we do about all this? Well, it all comes down to attention and awareness in both the conscious and unconscious mind. There are 3 ways to go about one's own attentive awareness. The first was discussed earlier on, a restless state of either inflation or possession without any sense of self. The second is a reflective state of contemplation, concentration, and focus. And the third, is an empty and open state of awareness, a sense of flow. Let's discuss these final 2 as they lead to the art of cultivating stillness. Imagine a flashlight. As you bring it closer, attending to one thing, you increase the focus of light. This increases the amount of light in one direction, but the background is darkened. And as you bring the flashlight back, you'll notice that the light decreases, but the background can be seen. The first example helps one see things clearly, helps one focus on one thing, but that loses sight of the whole. And the second, the whole can be seen, but it's dimmed. So the art of stillness is both bringing that flashlight back to see the whole, but also having enough light to be attentive to it all. The first example, the bringing in or increase in light, can be seen as the stilling of the conscious mind. In this, the movements, the thoughts and emotions, the triggers, projections, and dreams all are attended to by the ego. Dream work, shadow work, watching oneself throughout the day, whatever you want to call it, all of this increases the attention of consciousness, an attention as we saw today that has been under attack. This one side of the art leads to the separation, the death. As Carl Jung writes, in every typical course of an analysis, greater awareness emerges through realizing repressions, projections, and so on. The ego is intertwined in conflict with the objects. One is still a part of a process. Only in the continuation of analysis does the analogy with yoga set in that consciousness is severed from its objects. This process is linked up with the process of individuation, which begins with the self severing itself as unique from the objects and the ego. It is as if consciousness separated from the objects and from the ego and immigrated to the non-ego, to the other center, to the foreign yet originally own. This detachment of consciousness is a freeing from the passions and from the entanglement with the realm of objects. This is something which I cannot prove philosophically any further. It is a psychical experience, which in practice is expressed as a feeling of deliverance. What has caused one to be previously seized with panic is not a panic anymore. One is capable of seeing the tension of opposites of the world without agitation. One does not become apathetic, but is freed from entanglement. Consciousness removed to a sphere of objectlessness. This experience has its effects in practical life, and indeed in the most palpable way. It is illustrated probably most beautifully in the tale of Buddha being threatened by Mara. Mara and all his demons assail him, but the throne of Buddha is empty. He is simply not sitting there anymore. And while this focus on attentive awareness is important, as it humbles the ego from its tyrannical rule over the soul, there is another side that's just as important to entering stillness. And without it, there is no stilling. When our soul is stilled, it can be used as a vehicle for the spirit, as opposed to when it's consciously restless and a vehicle of the ego. This leads to the point of incubation, tapas, or any meditation which allows for an openness and receptivity towards oneself. In our flashlight example, this is that bringing the light back to shine deeper, to see the whole. While focused attention helps still the ego, it is this deep open awareness which helps still the soul. And this all has scientific backing. As most of you know, the split hemisphere of the brain. The left is grounded in the parts, in the mechanical, and the right works in a more holistic manner, seeing how parts come together to make a whole. So you see how both focused attention and open awareness attends to each hemisphere in the brain. I like to call these two disciplines, or meditations, concentrative and opening. A stilling of the conscious mind or ego is a concentrative meditation, that bringing the light in of the flashlight, and the stilling of the unconscious mind or soul is the opening, that bringing back the light. On the concentrative meditations, Carl Jung writes, when meditation is concerned with the objective products of the unconscious that reach consciousness spontaneously, it unites the conscious with contents that proceed not from a conscious causal chain, but from an essentially unconscious process. We cannot know what the unconscious psyche is, otherwise it would be conscious. We can only conjecture its existence, though there are good enough grounds for this. Part of the unconscious contents is projected, but the projection as such is not recognized. Meditation or critical introspection and objective investigation of the object are needed in order to establish the existence of projections. If the individual is to take stock of himself, it is essential that his projections should be recognized, because they falsify the nature of the object, and besides this, contain items which belong to his own personality, and should be integrated with it. This is one of the most important phases in the wearisome process of self-knowledge. And sticking with Jung, he leads us into the opening meditations. And real quickly before we get there, I've been thinking about active imagination and if it's more of a concentrative or opening meditation. And the best I could say is it's somewhere in the middle. There is a part of the ego concentrating through the images, interacting with what's coming through, but there's also that opening of allowing things to move on its own. So I see it as a great way to begin to work towards that opening, that deep stillness in such meditative practices like incubation. And as I said, Jung leads us into the opening meditations, as he wrote, "If the ancient art of meditation is practiced at all today, it is practiced only in religious or philosophical circles, where a theme is subjectively chosen by the mediant or prescribed by an instructor, as in certain theosophical exercises that developed under Indian influence. These methods are of value only for increasing concentration or consolidating consciousness, but have no significance as regards to effecting a synthesis of the personality. On the contrary, their purpose is to shield consciousness from the unconscious and to suppress it. Removing the shield, the veil, is to begin to know. This is where stillness leads. And it's something that cannot be done with just pure concentrative work. It requires that idea of the opening meditations. And someone closely acquainted to Carl Jung, Richard Wilhelm, beautifully captures what this means. Now, if the work has led into the blissful fields, the heart is like the reflecting surface of water. When things come, it mirrors things. When they go, spirit and power spontaneously unite and do not allow themselves to be carried away by outside things. This is what the master means when he says, every interference of the thought with other people and with oneself must be completely given up. When the pupil succeeds in concentrating with true thoughts on the place of power, he does not have to start the light circulating, and the light circulates by itself. But when the light circulates, the elixir is made spontaneously, and the performance of worldly tasks at the same time is not a hindrance. It is different at the beginning of the work of meditation, when spirit and power are still scattered and confused. If worldly affairs cannot be kept at a distance, and a quiet place found where one can concentrate with all one's power, and thus avoid all disturbances from ordinary occupations, the one is perhaps industrious in the morning, and certainly lazy in the evening. How long would it take in this way till a man attains to the real secrets? Therefore it is said, when one begins to apply the work, one should put aside household affairs. And if that is not wholly possible, so one ought to be engaged to look after them, so that one can take pains with complete attention. But when one's work is so far advanced that secret confirmations are experienced, it does not matter if, at the same time, the ordinary affairs are put in order so that one can fulfill one's karma. This means the living manner of the circulation of the light. Long ago, the true man of the purple polar light made a saying, when a man lives in contact with the world, and yet still in harmony with the light, then the round is round and the angular has angles. Then he lives among men concealed, yet visible, different, and yet the same, and none can compass it. Then no one takes note of our secret life and being. The living manner of the circulation of the light has just this meaning, to live in contact with the world, and yet in harmony with the light. And that final line, just like only meditating in concentration, provides the true wholeness of cultivating stillness. To truly be still, one must not only be in harmony with the world, or only with the light, but each. We are here, in the middle of matter and spirit, and thus each are us. To escape the world is to escape yourself. just as the masses do with their spirit. To place trust in no thing while surrounded by a world of things is one of the most difficult things to do. But it is that final release, that death, a trust fall into the endless black pit where everything comes alive. And this brings us back to the sad, restless state of affairs today. In order for anything new to become, the old must be cleared, not swept into a closet to create space, not swallowing a pill to stimulate it over, but completely destroyed. Which means the way forward into this new age that many are so excited about heads straight towards death, saying apocalypse to our culture. Carl Jung puts it best as he highlights in the answer to Job, Aquarius sets aflame Lucifer's harsh forces. Could anyone in his right senses deny that John correctly foresaw at least some of the possible dangers which threatened our world in the final phase of the Christian aeon? It is easy to ignore reality and chase after the 10,000 restless distractions, and it's difficult to face the reality of what is. But the 10,000 take your life and turn you dead, while reality turns your death into life. I believe what is to come is going to be an inner revolution. As much as we've realized outside, we'll begin to witness within. There is a reality ahead that we cannot fathom today, just as the ancients couldn't fathom our technology today. And the most important thing to realize is to step into that other, what is to come. One must be still. I began with the phrase, be still and know, and then moved my mouth about being still and didn't speak much about knowing. What is this knowing that knows in stillness? Some call it the logos, the Greek nous, divine intelligence, the higher self, the Jungian self. I'm sure there are many names that point out the same aspect of consciousness in us all. The one thing that's for sure is that it's not human. It weaves in and out of everything you see, down to the what looks to be still rock. And yet our world is ignorant. It's built on a distrust of oneself and a need for help. Stillness is beautiful. It breaks all the ties and bonds. It is that therapy of no therapy. It is that learning of no learning, the healing of no healer. Stillness is the therapist, the teacher, the healer. And it's amazing to reflect upon because, as I said earlier, our society has outsourced themselves. Meanwhile, all along, with you the entire time is the greatest source you'll ever come across. There's no money to be paid to it, no one specific to follow, no verse to memorize, no mantra to repeat, no specifically bodily pose, no church service to attend. Anything that everyone goes towards will keep them moving, keep them busy. It won't get them still. And everything that anyone goes towards places themselves in the middle, instead of providing you, like Socrates or Parmenides or Pythagoras. The only medium there is yourself. Stillness is anti-anxiety, it's anti-depression, anti-stress. It sees through and under the surface. It gives you insights that you can never personally achieve. Ultimately, in stillness, one regains their senses and comes to common sense, the common sense in the collective consciousness itself. Stillness is a stimulant for the Jungian notion of individuation, because one is incubating that self, that divine consciousness or awareness in oneself, providing that warmth to bring it to life, to make the unconscious conscious, to put eyes and ears to the dead in the underworld, to introvert awareness and libido back to its source. And to bring it all together, I'll read a beautiful excerpt from the ancient Vedas. Then the one that was hidden in the shell was born through the force of fiery torment. From it there arose in the beginning love, which is the germ and seed of knowledge. The wise found the root of being in non-being by investigating the impulses of the human heart. This speaks about everything we've covered. The one, the self, is hidden within oneself and is born through incubation, self-heating, tapas. And in this, there was a union, there was love that arose. And this union is the seed of knowledge, or knowing. And its roots are found not in the subject, the ego and its movements, but in the stillness which leads to the root of being. And this root of being, which is found in non-being, non-ego, is found by investigating the impulses of the heart, the soul, the unconscious. If you imagine consciousness as something breathing, you can see an exchange between subject and object. In the right movement and stilling, there's an in and out breath. The self draws out when the ego draws in, or when acting in the world, the ego draws out and the self in. But if the ego constantly draws out and never comes in for a breath, then life is suffocated by your own hands. There's of course much more to say and explore on this idea of stillness, but I hope this exploration stimulated something in you. If you have anything to add on stillness or your own experiences, let me know in the comments. I appreciate you all, and I look forward to what is to come in the future. Until then, stay humble.